I still remember the fear in his eyes as if it were yesterday, though so many years have passed and so many faces have come and gone through these hospital halls. There are certain moments that etch themselves into your soul, and that night, with the rain tapping against the windows and the fluorescent lights flickering above, is one I carry with me like a scar. He was just a boy, really, though the world had already pressed too much weight onto his thin shoulders. His name was Andrew, and he arrived during the quietest hour of my shift, when the world outside seemed to pause, and the only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors and the distant hum of a cleaning cart. He clung to a battered old backpack, the kind with frayed straps and patches sewn on by a loving hand, and he wouldn't let it out of his sight for a second. I'd seen children come in with all sorts of treasures, stuffed animals, comic books, even rocks from their backyard. But I'd never seen anyone hold on to something the way Andrew held that backpack. He was trembling, his lips pressed into a thin line, eyes darting from me to the door and back again. When I tried to reassure him, to tell him he was safe here, he just shook his head and hugged the bag tighter. I knelt beside his bed, the way I've done for so many frightened souls over the years, and I spoke softly, telling him my name was Martha and that I'd be here all night if he needed anything. That's when he grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, and whispered, "Please don't open my backpack, please." There was a desperation in his voice that cut right through me, a kind of pleading I'd only heard from people who had lost too much too soon. I promised him I wouldn't touch it, and I meant it in that moment. I've always believed in respecting a patient's wishes, especially when the world has already taken so much from them. But as the night wore on, things changed. Andrew's breathing grew shallow, and his skin turned the kind of pale that makes your heart drop into your stomach. I called for the doctor, and the room filled with the quiet urgency that comes when you know something is terribly wrong, but you don't yet know what. Through it all, Andrew kept one hand on that backpack, even if he drifted in and out of consciousness. I found myself wondering what could possibly be inside that meant so much to him, what secret he was so desperate to protect. In all my years, I've learned that people carry more than just physical wounds into this place. They bring their fears, their hopes, their memories, and sometimes their burdens are heavier than anything we can see on the outside. I wish I could say I wasn't curious, that I didn't think about that backpack every time I checked his vitals or adjusted his blanket. But the truth is, I did. I've seen enough to know that sometimes what's hidden away can be the key to understanding someone's pain. And when the moment came, when I had to make a choice between keeping my promise and doing what I thought was right, I reached for the bag, my hands trembling almost as much as his had been. What I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about pain, about secrets, about the ways people try to survive. My name is Martha, and after everything I've seen, after all the nights spent holding hands, whispering comfort, and witnessing both miracles and heartbreak, I still believe that even the strongest hearts can shatter in silence. And sometimes it's what we're most afraid to reveal that needs the most gentle touch. There's a certain stillness that settles over the hospital after midnight, a hush that feels sacred in its own way. The world outside fades away, and inside, the halls are filled with soft, echoing footsteps and the quiet routines of those of us who keep watch while others sleep. That night, I'd come on for the late shift, the one I always volunteered for, maybe because I knew what it was like to be awake when everyone else was at home. The nurse's station was cluttered with empty coffee cups, a half-eaten packet of crackers, and a stack of patient charts already smudged with fingerprints and hurried notes. My friend and fellow nurse, Jean, was finishing up her paperwork, and she gave me a tired smile as I pulled on my sweater, a hand-knit thing I'd worn through so many winters and heartbreaks. There's a different kind of vulnerability at night. The old men in room 212 tend to call out for wives long gone, and the young mothers in maternity hum lullabies under their breath. You notice little things more acutely, the way the clock ticks, the way a patient sighs in their sleep, the the way loneliness thickens the air. I always made a point of checking on everyone, especially the children. They never belonged in a place like this, but life isn't fair, and that's something you learn the hard way. That evening before Andrew arrived, I'd been tending to Mr. Richard in 207, a gentle, stubborn man with a failing heart and a sharp sense of humor. He liked to pretend he didn't need help, but he always waited until I came by to ask for an extra blanket. Down the hall, Joyce, a grandmother with eyes like faded denim, sat knitting by her window, waiting for her daughter, who never seemed to visit as often as she promised. These were my people, my family in a way. I carried their stories with me, and they carried mine too, in the soft exchanges we shared between pain and hope. Sometimes, when the night grew especially quiet, I'd find myself thinking about all the years I'd spent in these halls, all the faces I'd seen, and all the hands I'd held. There's a kind of comfort in routine, but also a deep ache, knowing that every night brings its own set of challenges and heartbreaks. But that night, there was a heaviness I couldn't shake, something in the air that made me pause at every closed door. When Andrew was wheeled in, shivering and clutching that backpack, I felt it right away, the sense that something was deeply wrong, and not just with his health. The admitting doctor, Dr. George, gave me a look over the top of his glasses, the kind we shared when a case was more than it seemed. Andrew's chart was thin, just a few scribbled notes, and a number that meant very little to anyone but him. It was his eyes, though, that told the real story. I've seen pain, real pain, in children before, but this was different. It was as if he'd learned not to trust the world, and all he had left was that bag he wouldn't let go. I guided him gently to his room, speaking in the soft, practiced voice I'd used to calm so many frightened souls. I wanted him to know he was safe, even if just for a few hours. The night stretched on ahead of us, and as I settled him in and listened to the distant thunder rolling outside, I couldn't help but wonder what burdens he had carried through our hospital doors, and what it would cost to help him lay them down. I remember pausing at his doorway for a moment longer than usual, watching as he curled himself around that backpack, his whole body tense, as if bracing for something terrible. In that moment, I felt the weight of all the nights I'd spent in this place, all the secrets I'd kept for others, and all the times I'd wished I could do more than just offer comfort. Sometimes, it's not the medicine or the machines that heal. It's the simple act of being present, of bearing witness to someone's pain, and letting them know they're not alone, no matter how dark the night becomes. The next few hours unfolded with a slow, aching rhythm that only those who have worked long nights in a hospital can truly understand. I made my rounds, checking on my usual patients, but my mind kept wandering back to Andrew. Every time I passed his door, I'd glance inside to see him lying on his side, still clinging to that backpack as if it were a lifeline, his small frame swallowed up by the starched white sheets. There was something about the way he watched the door, eyes wide and unblinking, that made me ache for him. I tried to imagine what it must be like to be so young and yet so wary, to feel that you couldn't let go of the one thing that still belonged to you in this world. I saw myself in him, just a little, remembering the girl I used to be, clutching my grandmother's locket when the world felt too loud and uncertain. As the night deepened, a storm rolled in, rattling the windows and making the old building creak and groan. I checked in on Joyce, who was still awake, her needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on what she told me would be a scarf for her granddaughter. We shared a few quiet words, just enough to remind each other that kindness can still be found in the smallest exchanges. Down the hall, Mr. Richard had finally drifted off to sleep, his snores muffled by the thin curtain that separated him from the world. I paused outside Andrew's room, feeling the weight of the key I carried, not just the one that opened medicine cabinets or supply closets, but the one that came from being trusted, from being the person a frightened child might turn to in the darkest hour. I watched the monitors blink, their patterns familiar and oddly comforting. Sometimes, when the world outside feels like it's unraveling, the steady beep of a heart monitor is the only thing that keeps you grounded. Still, underneath that rhythm, I could sense Andrew's fear, palpable, living, like a second heart beating in the room. He barely spoke, but his silence was loud with questions and memories he was too young to carry. I sat with him for a while, just keeping him company, hoping my presence would ease his burden, if only a little. I told him stories about my own childhood, about a dog I once had named Daisy, about how I used to sneak cookies from the kitchen when I thought no one was looking. He listened, eyes wide and solemn, and though he didn't smile, I could tell he was listening. Sometimes all we can offer is a gentle voice in the dark. The hospital seemed to breathe with us, the walls holding in our secrets and our hopes. In those hours, I was reminded of all the reasons I'd chosen this life, the way a simple touch or a quiet word could mean so much. I saw myself not as a nurse just tending to wounds, but as a keeper of stories, a witness to the quiet courage it takes to keep going, even when you're afraid. As the hours slipped by, I found myself hoping that Andrew would let me in, that he might tell me what haunted him, or at least let me carry some of his sorrow for a while. I remember thinking about all the people I had met over the years, each one carrying their own invisible burdens, and how sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stay. If you're listening to this, I wonder, what is it that you hold close, especially on the hardest nights? Please, if you feel comfortable, tell me from where in the world you're hearing my story. I'd love to know I'm not alone in remembering these quiet hours, and that somewhere, someone else understands what it means to keep a promise in the dark. Sometimes in a hospital, the deepest silence falls just before the storm. That stillness hung in the air, heavy and almost electric, as I moved through the late hours of my shift. I checked on Andrew more times than I could count, each time finding him curled tighter around that backpack, his breath shallow, his body tense. I knew, in the way only a nurse with too many years behind her can know, that something was changing. The monitors at his bedside, which had been steady all night, started to flicker with irregular patterns, the beeps skipping beats like a heart that's lost its rhythm. I felt the shift in the room, the way fear hangs, thick and real, when you sense a life is slipping through your fingers. It was just before 4 a.m. when I heard the sudden gasp from Andrew's room. I rushed inside, the world narrowing to the sound of his labored breathing and the wild, desperate pounding of my own heart. His lips had gone bluish, his eyes wild with panic, darting to the door, to me, and always back to that backpack. I called for Dr. George, my voice steady but my hands trembling. There's a kind of choreography in emergencies, the crash cart rolling in, the doctor barking orders, the soft shuffle of nurses moving as one. But all the while, Andrew kept reaching for that bag, his knuckles white, his fear screaming louder than words ever could. I tried to comfort him as the team worked, an oxygen mask, a needle in his arm, monitors blinking warnings. My hand found his, and he squeezed it with a strength that surprised me, his eyes pleading. "Don't let them take it," he begged, his voice broken. "Don't let them look inside." In the chaos, I caught a glimpse of the others exchanging worried glances. I wanted to promise him again, but I knew we might not have time for promises. I could see the pain in his eyes, the kind that comes from a secret too heavy for a child to bear. The tension in the room was suffocating. I've seen many things in my years. Mothers collapsing at news they feared, fathers holding back tears for the sake of their children, and patients fighting for breath in the middle of the night. But something about Andrew's terror, the way he fixated on that backpack even as his life seemed to slip away, was different. It was the look of someone who'd lost everything but that one last thing. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. Should I respect his wish or do what might be needed to save him? As the machine screamed warnings and Dr. George prepared for the worst, I made a decision that I knew would haunt me. I leaned close and whispered, "I'll keep it safe, Andrew, I promise, but you have to let us help you." He nodded, the smallest movement, and for a moment his hand loosened its grip on the backpack. It was a moment of trust, fragile and precious. I held on to that, even as the chaos surged all around us. In that instant, I felt the full weight of what it means to be a nurse, not just to treat wounds, but to hold someone's fears and hopes in your own trembling hands. And I prayed, in the quiet way nurses pray, that I would do right by this child, even if it broke my heart. That night, in the hush before dawn, the true test of my calling arrived, not in a textbook emergency, but in the desperate, silent plea of a scared little boy who needed more than medicine. He needed someone to see him, to believe him, to protect the only thing he had left. And I realized that sometimes the hardest choice isn't between life and death, but between keeping a promise and breaking it for the sake of a greater mercy. I stood there, surrounded by the hum of machines and the anxious faces of my colleagues, and felt the weight of every child I'd ever cared for, every secret I'd ever kept, pressing down on my shoulders. In that moment, I understood that nursing is not just about skill or knowledge, it's about heart, about standing in the gap when someone is too afraid to stand alone. That night, I was that person for Andrew, and I knew the consequences of my choices would echo long after the sun rose. The complications that night came not just from medicine, but from the tangled web of fear, secrets, and heartbreak that Andrew brought into that small hospital room. The storm outside had grown worse, rain pelting the windows, thunder rolling through the halls, and it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. Every nurse who has spent enough years under these harsh lights knows that the worst moments come at the quietest hours. And tonight, the challenges came one after another, relentless and unyielding. Andrew's breathing became ragged and shallow, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. The monitors screamed out warnings. His heart was racing, then slowing, then racing again. Dr. George and I worked together in that tense, practice dance that only comes from hard-earned trust. I could see the worry in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched each time the numbers dipped too low. We tried everything, oxygen, fluids, medication, but Andrew seemed to be drifting further away, his small hand still clutching the backpack with the strength of someone clinging to life itself. But the complications weren't just clinical. My own mind raced with 1,000 questions and a growing sense of helplessness, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I had done it so many times before and still couldn't guarantee a miracle. Every time I touched Andrew's arm or brushed his hair from his forehead, I felt the burden he carried. I wondered what it must have been like for him to hold on to that backpack through countless days and nights, and what secret could possibly be so powerful that it outweighed his own fear of dying. I thought of all the children I'd cared for over the years, each with their own silent pain, and how we nurses are asked to be healers, counselors, and sometimes the last witnesses to a life story. There were moments that night when I felt utterly powerless, despite all my years in the field. It's true, experience can make you wise, but it doesn't make you invulnerable. I saw the way the younger nurses looked to me for guidance, their faces tense, their hands sometimes shaking. I tried to anchor us all with my calm, but inside I was remembering every loss, every family I had ever failed, every time I'd sat in a quiet room after the chaos, grieving alone. Andrew's fear pulled at something deep inside me, something I couldn't ignore. I tried to reassure him, to promise again that his backpack would be safe, that I would not let anyone take it away. But I saw the doubt in his eyes. He had learned too early that adults don't always keep their word, that safety is sometimes just a wish whispered in the dark. The complications grew as the night wore on. Andrew began to hallucinate, mumbling about things I couldn't see, his words slurring, his grip on reality slipping. The team wanted to sedate him, to take the bag for examination, but I stood my ground. There was a line I would not cross unless there was no other choice. I pleaded with Dr. George for just a little more time, and he agreed, trusting my instincts as he often did. In those moments, I felt the full weight of my own history. Every patient who had trusted me, every promise I had made and sometimes broken, every ghost that still walked these corridors at night. My hands trembled as I wiped Andrew's brow, and I realized that, even after all these years, I was not immune to the fear of failing someone who needed me most. When Andrew finally lost consciousness, his grip slackened just enough. The team looked to me, waiting for my decision. My heart pounded as I reached for the backpack, knowing that whatever I found inside would carry its own kind of pain. But I hesitated, even then, because I understood that sometimes the hardest part of this job is not the medicine, not the emergencies, but the choices we make in the name of compassion. I held that bag, feeling its weight and his trust, and I whispered a quiet prayer for him, for myself, for all the lost and frightened souls who passed through our hands. If this story touches something inside you, if you've ever carried a secret or a burden through your own storms, I hope you'll stay with me and share your own story. Please consider subscribing or sharing a moment when you too had to make an impossible choice, because none of us are truly alone in these long, complicated nights. There are nights in this profession when you feel the weight of the world pressing down on your shoulders, and that night with Andrew was one of those nights that seemed to stretch on forever, each minute heavier than the last. The storm outside had become a kind of cruel soundtrack, thunder shaking the windows and rain lashing at the glass, as if the world itself was mourning along with us. Inside, the hospital felt impossibly small and close, every sound amplified. The frantic beeping of Andrew's monitors, the hurried footsteps of nurses, the low, urgent voices of doctors conferring in the hallway. Andrew's condition had become critical, his breathing so shallow it was barely there, the color drained from his cheeks, his lips tinged with blue. Even with all our interventions, oxygen, fluids, careful doses of medication, his little body was slipping further away, and all the medical wisdom in the world felt useless in the face of his terror. The backpack remained nestled against his side, the last line of defense he had left in the world, and in the midst of the chaos, it had become a symbol of something much bigger than anyone else in the room could understand. The complications that night were more than just medical. They were deeply, painfully human. As I watched the younger nurses hesitate, waiting for my lead, I saw my own younger self in their faces, full of hope and fear and the desperate wish to do the right thing. I remembered all the years when I thought experience would someday make me immune to doubt, to heartbreak, but it never does. I felt every loss I'd ever carried, every secret I'd ever been trusted with, every time I'd sat in a quiet room after the rush had faded and mourned alone. Andrew's fear, his desperate need to protect what was inside that bag, reached into the deepest corners of my own heart. I knew that whatever lay inside, it was bound to pain and memory and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, something could be kept safe in a world that so often isn't. Andrew's mind began to wander as his body weakened. He mumbled about things I couldn't see, his words slurring, sometimes crying out for someone named Laura, sometimes just whispering, "Don't let go." The team wanted to sedate him, to take the backpack for examination, but I stood my ground. There are lines we cross in medicine, but there are lines of the soul too, and I couldn't let his last moments be marked by betrayal. I pleaded with Dr. George for more time, and he gave it to me, not just out of trust, but because he too had seen what happens when we forget that healing isn't just about drugs and machines. When Andrew finally slipped into unconsciousness, His fingers loosened their grip on the bag. The staff looked at me, waiting for my decision. My hand shook as I reached for the backpack, knowing that this was a moment I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. Nurses are trained to handle emergencies, to keep cool under pressure, but nothing prepares you for the quiet, soul-deep heartbreak of seeing a child's last defense fall away. I hesitated, even then, because I didn't want to be the one who broke his trust. But the monitors kept screaming, and sometimes mercy means making the hardest decision. I whispered a quiet prayer as I gently lifted the backpack from Andrew's side. A prayer for him, for all the children like him, for every person who's ever clung to something just to feel safe in the dark. My colleagues watched in silence. I could feel the weight of their expectations and the unspoken question in their eyes. Would opening that backpack help save him, or would it be the final heartbreak? In that moment, I realized that the greatest test of a nurse isn't just skill or knowledge. It's the willingness to stand in the fire, to hold another's pain as if it were your own, and to do what needs to be done even if it breaks something inside you. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever faced a moment when compassion clashed with duty, I invite you to subscribe and to share your own story. We are never truly alone in our heartbreak, and sometimes the bravest thing of all is simply to be present in the darkest hour. After the chaos, there is always a strange sort of quiet, one that settles over the room like a gentle shroud. When Andrew finally slipped into unconsciousness and his frantic grip on the backpack loosened, it was as if the entire world had exhaled, even if just for a moment. I stood there with the bag in my hands, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the beeping of the monitors, the whispers of my colleagues, and even the distant rumble of thunder that still lingered outside. In that silence, I felt a kind of peace, a fragile peace, but real, settle over me, the same way it has so many times before after a night filled with struggle and heartbreak. The team around me moved with practiced efficiency, stabilizing Andrew, doing what needed to be done. Dr. George gave me a nod of understanding, the sort of gesture that passes between those who have fought many battles together in the small hours of the night. I remember brushing Andrew's hair from his forehead, whispering that he had been so brave, that he was safe, and that I would keep my promise for as long as I could. The weight of the backpack in my hands was heavier than I could have expected. Not just the physical object, but the burden of trust and hope that it represented. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I sat beside Andrew's bed, holding the bag in my lap, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, and feeling the exhaustion seep into my bones. There is a kind of sacredness to these moments, a hush that is almost spiritual. A reminder that after every storm, there is a chance for rest, for reflection, for gratitude. I thought of all the nights I had spent in hospitals, of all the lives I had touched, and all the pain I had witnessed, and how each of those stories had left a mark on my soul. In that quiet room, lit only by the soft glow of the monitors and the occasional flash of lightning, I found myself praying, not just for Andrew, but for all the children who come into our care carrying burdens too big for their small shoulders. I prayed for wisdom, for gentleness, for the strength to face whatever I might find when the time came to look inside that backpack. As the night finally began to give way to the first pale light of dawn, I realized that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply staying by someone's side, holding their fears with tender hands, and reminding them that even in the darkest hours, they are not alone. The hospital, so full of tension and urgency just hours before, now felt almost peaceful. Nurses moved quietly through the halls, voices hushed, as if not to disturb the fragile calm that had settled over us all. I watched the sky outside Andrew's window shift from black to the softest blue, and I thought about the countless sunrises I'd witnessed from this very place. Each one a promise that no matter how long the night, morning always comes. I took a moment to check on my other patients, offering a gentle word or a reassuring touch. Mr. Richard was sleeping soundly, his breathing even and calm. Joyce had finally set her knitting aside and drifted off, her hands folded over her chest, her face peaceful in the early light. These small, ordinary moments felt precious, proof that life goes on even after the hardest nights. When I returned to Andrew's room, I sat for a while longer, simply watching him breathe, feeling the weight of everything we'd both endured. I realized that healing doesn't always happen in dramatic bursts. Sometimes it's found in the quiet aftermath, in the simple act of being present, of bearing witness to another's suffering and survival. As the sun finally crested the horizon, bathing the room in a gentle gold, I felt a sense of acceptance settle over me. Whatever was inside that backpack, whatever secrets or memories it held, I knew I would face them with the same compassion I tried to offer Andrew all night long. And in that moment, I understood that the calm after the storm isn't just about relief. It's about finding meaning in the struggle, about honoring the trust we're given, and about holding on to hope, even when it feels impossibly fragile. I waited until the world was still, the sky outside Andrew's window painted with the soft gold of early morning, and the hush of the hospital broken only by the quiet shuffle of nurses changing shifts. I placed my hand gently on that battered backpack, feeling the worn canvas beneath my fingertips. So many stories stitched into its seams, so many secrets hidden away. I'd promised Andrew I would keep it safe, but I also knew that sometimes mercy demands more than a promise. With trembling hands, I finally unzipped the bag. Inside, I found not money or medicine or anything the doctors expected. There were two small stuffed animals, one with a missing ear, the other patched with blue thread, a faded photograph of a woman and a boy smiling in a sunlit park, and a bundle of dog-eared letters tied with bright red yarn. The smell of old paper and soft fabric filled the room, and as I laid the contents out one by one, the truth became clear. These were the last pieces of Andrew's world, the remnants of a childhood cut short and a family torn apart. The photograph was of Andrew and, I realized, his mother Laura, the name he'd whispered in delirium. The letters were written in a shaky, loving script, each one signed, "Love, Mom. I'll always be with you." Some were birthday wishes, others gentle reassurances, all of them words of comfort for a boy who had lost his anchor. There was no mystery, no dangerous contraband, only the most fragile treasures a child can carry. Memories, love, the tangible proof that he had once belonged to someone who cared. I sat there for a long time, tears sliding down my cheeks as the weight of it all settled in my chest. I realized then that Andrew's fear wasn't about the contents themselves, but about the possibility of losing the last thread connecting him to his mother. That backpack was his lifeline, his shield against a world that had taken too much already. It made perfect sense why his grip on it had been so fierce, why every adult's touch had felt like a threat. I gathered the items back into the bag with the utmost care, whispering a promise to Andrew that I would protect them, that I would protect him as long as he needed. As the morning sun filled the room, Andrew stirred, his eyelids fluttering. I sat beside him and told him, in the softest voice I could manage, that his treasures were safe. I saw a flicker of relief pass across his fragile face, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to hope for his healing, not just of body, but of heart. In all my years as a nurse, I've learned that the greatest wounds are often the ones we can't see, and the bravest thing anyone can do is to hold on to love, even when the world tries to strip it away. What happened that night with Andrew taught me that compassion sometimes means breaking a promise to keep a child whole. that the weight we carry for others is both a burden and a blessing. We are the keepers of each other's stories, the hands that hold another's pain when it gets too heavy to bear alone. If you've carried something precious through your own storm, if you've ever been afraid to let go, know that you are not alone. The world is full of quiet, unseen acts of courage, some as simple as holding a backpack through the darkest night. My name is Martha, and after a lifetime of tending to broken hearts and battered bodies, I can tell you this. The most important thing we can give each other is not answers or fixes, but presence, tenderness, and the promise that even in the silence, someone understands. Thank you for listening to my story. May you find comfort in your own, and may you always have someone to share the weight. And if you ever find yourself holding on to something for dear life, remember that sometimes letting someone in is the bravest thing you can do. That's what Andrew taught me, and it's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my days.